Hey everyone, welcome back to Void Signal. Before we start, I just want to say thanks for being here. Seriously, whether you've been around for a while or you just clicked on this because the title caught your attention, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you end up enjoying the story, leaving a like or a comment helps a lot more than it probably should, but that's just how YouTube works. And if you're not subscribed yet, feel free to do that too. No pressure, it just helps keep the channel going. All right, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. I was never supposed to open the archive. That's the lie I told myself for years. The truth is worse. I was hired because I would open it. The folder was labeled with a designation format NASA stopped using before I was born. Blocky, utilitarian, pre-digital. No title, no mission patch. Just a date stamped twice, as if someone wanted to make sure it was remembered. 1986. 1986. Inside were audio logs, telemetry summaries, psychological evaluations, and one thing that didn't belong anywhere near a civilian contractor like me. A quarantine directive signed by 3 agencies that officially did not collaborate in that decade. The subject line read, Mars Extrasolar Habitability Outpost. Status, quarantined, not failed, not destroyed, not lost, quarantined. I remember sitting back in my chair, the hum of the server room suddenly too loud, too present. Mars missions from the 80s were supposed to be robotic fantasies, dreams that died with budget cuts and political shifts. Crewed outpost? Impossible. Classified or not, something that big leaves fingerprints, unless the fingerprints were deliberately burned off. The logs began normally. That was the most unsettling part. Commander Ellis, Habitat A, Sol 14. Voices confident, even bored. Complaints about recycled air, dust infiltration, gravity sickness that lingered longer than simulations predicted. I'd heard the same tone in ISS recordings. Professionals adapting, normalizing the impossible. But then there were gaps, weeks of missing data, not corrupted, absent, as if no one had dared press record. When the logs resumed, the timestamps were inconsistent, days repeated, Sol numbers skipped backward, and the voices sounded different, not panicked, not injured, slower. Measured in a way that suggested the speakers were choosing their words with great care, like someone explaining something to a child who might misunderstand and hurt themselves. I flagged the anomaly and pulled the classified probe data from the secondary partition, the one hidden behind credentials I wasn't officially given. That probe was my work. At least, the modern one was. We'd launched it 18 months earlier, under a harmless-sounding astrobiology initiative. Autonomous, non-retrieval, no-return trajectory. The public summary said it was designed to analyze subsurface ice and radiation effects on dormant microbes. That was also a lie. The probe had been aimed with surgical precision at a dead zone on Mars no satellite imaging could quite explain. A patch of land that distorted sensor readings, just enough to be written off as interference. Except it wasn't interference in 1986 either. The first live feed from the probe had come in while I was asleep. I watched it later, alone, with the lights dimmed, as if instinctively preparing for bad news. The camera cleared the horizon, and there it was. The outpost, not buried, not shattered, not eroded into rusted bones by decades of storms, intact. Solar arrays angled toward the weak sun, still tracking. External lights cycling on and off in a pattern that matched no automated protocol I recognized. The habitat hull bore scars, micrometeor impacts, stress fractures, but the pressure seals were green. Green means alive. I remember whispering, "That's not possible," even though no one could hear me. Then the life sign scan initialized. Multiple readings, human range biometrics. Erratic, but present. Heat, motion, electrical activity consistent with neural patterns. Inside. I should have reported it immediately. Triggered the chain. Let the people with more clearance than conscience decide what came next. Instead, I listened. One of the recovered audio files had been flagged but never transcribed. The system warned of non-standard waveform behavior. That should have scared me more than it did. I pressed play. At first, it was just breathing. Too close to the mic. Too intimate. A slow inhale, followed by a pause that stretched long enough for my skin to prickle. Then an exhale that carried a faint harmonic undertone, as if more than one set of lungs were sharing the same chest. Then a voice. "My name is Dr. Aaron Hale," it said. My name. No, the same name. I'd checked the personnel list earlier. Same spelling, same middle initial, same specialty. Astrobiology systems integration. I laughed once, sharp and involuntary. Coincidences happen. Names repeat. But then the voice continued. "If you are hearing this," it said, "then the quarantine has held longer than we anticipated. That is encouraging." The recording crackled, and for a moment I thought it had ended. Then something else spoke. Not a second voice exactly. More like the same voice, offset, slightly delayed, slightly deeper, as if echoing from inside a much larger space. "We are still here," it said, "and we are still learning." I stopped the playback. My reflection in the darkened monitor didn't look like mine anymore. My eyes were too focused, too intent, like I'd finally found proof of something I'd suspected all along, but never dared articulate. Mars hadn't killed them. Mars had kept them. I pulled up the quarantine directive again, scrolling past legal language dense enough to smother meaning. Near the end, a single paragraph had been highlighted, annotated by hand in a scanned copy. The quarantine is not to prevent contamination of the colony. It is to prevent reintroduction. Reintroduction of what? I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, the probe sent an unsolicited data packet, compressed, unsigned, impossible under its communication constraints. It contained a single line of text. "You are asking the right questions. Come closer." That was when I understood something fundamental. The outpost hadn't gone silent in 1986. It had simply stopped talking to Earth. The next morning, I did what any reasonable person would do if they found a dead mission still breathing on another planet. I lied. I told my supervisor the overnight packet was a glitch. I told the compliance officer the waveform anomaly in the old logs was probably tape degradation. I told myself I was buying time to build a proper report, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to be the first person to understand it. The probe's new message shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just that the text looked like it had been typed by a human. It was that the probe didn't have a channel for freeform text uplinks. It had telemetry. It had compressed imagery. It had numerical return packets with strict formatting. Someone had used it like a throat, and someone, or something, had spoken through it. I pulled up the probe's command history. Every instruction we'd sent was there, time-stamped, signed, verified. But between our transmissions were gaps filled with activity that had no signature at all. Not corrupted, not spoofed, just unclaimed. Camera pan, infrared sweep, LiDAR pulse, microphone activation. The last one made my mouth go dry. We hadn't installed a microphone for ambience. It was for mechanical diagnostics. Listening for motor strain, joint friction, dust abrasion. A stethoscope, not an ear. And yet the audio file from the previous night wasn't motors. It was a low, steady tone that rose and fell like distant chanting, heard through thick walls. Underneath it, something clicked rhythmically, like a relay switching, or teeth tapping together in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. I sat there for a long time, headset on, letting the sound crawl along my nerves. I could feel my own pulse begin to sync with it. That terrified me more than the sound itself, and I yanked the headset off as if it had burned me. Then I opened the outpost schematics. The archive contained blueprints. Habitat A, Habitat B, a central hub, an External regolith berm for shielding, a greenhouse module, a drilling unit, a lab wing, a communications mast. It was more than a test outpost. It was a foothold, a statement, and it was designed for 6 crew. The probe's life sign scan had flagged 12. I recalibrated. I ran the scan again, thinking the algorithm was confusing machines for bodies, heat leaks for heartbeats. Still 12. I zoomed into the habitat hull with the probe's camera. The outer surface had a thin frosting of dust, but some areas were oddly clean, like something had brushed against them repeatedly. There were faint streaks around the airlock seam, as if the seal had been opened and closed not long ago. The idea of that, an airlock cycling after 40 years, made my stomach tighten. There was no wind that could do that, no storm that could mimic intention. The probe could have approached immediately. That was its purpose after all, to get close enough for sampling. But the original mission rules we'd been given were clear. We were to maintain a standoff distance and limit physical interaction with any anomalous structure. At the time, I'd thought it was bureaucratic caution, protecting a public-facing mission from the embarrassment of tampering with old hardware. Now I understood it was fear dressed in policy. I looked at the quarantine directive again. This time I read the margins, notes from hands that trembled just enough to show they weren't written in a calm office. If signals resume, do not answer. If movement observed, retreat probe. If entry required, do not breach habitat without thermal sterilization. Thermal sterilization. You sterilize surfaces. You sterilize tools. You sterilize instruments going into a clean room. You don't sterilize an entire habitat unless you believe what's inside is either contagious or not meant to be alive. My cursor hovered over the probe's navigation controls. I could bring it closer. I could circle the outpost, map every external feature. I could potentially position it near the airlock and use the manipulator arm to take a regolith sample from the berm, maybe even scrape residue from the seal. Every one of those actions would be logged. Eventually. But right then, in that silent server room, it was just me and a machine on another world, and a secret that felt like it had teeth. I keyed in a command. Slow approach. 10 meters, then stop. The probe obeyed. Its wheels chewed gently into the dust. The camera feed vibrated with each rotation. Mars looked the way it always does in footage, beautiful in a dead, ancient way. A landscape shaped by time rather than weather. A horizon that seemed too far away, as if distance had a different meaning there. At 50 meters, the chanting tone returned in the audio channel, stronger now, not louder, clearer. As if the probe was tuning into it the way a radio finds a station. At 30 meters, the life sign scan spiked, not in number, in intensity. Heartbeats, if that's what they were, began syncing. Multiple rhythms converging toward the same tempo, like an orchestra tightening around a single conductor. My hands clenched without my permission. I realized I was holding my own breath. Then the camera caught something in the outpost's observation window. A shape moved behind the glass. I leaned forward, nearly touching the monitor. The window was small, designed for structural integrity and radiation shielding. The glass looked dark, reflective, but something inside pressed close enough to fog it, leaving a pale smear as if a warm hand had touched a cold surface. Except it wasn't a hand. It was too wide. Too many joint angles. The imprint looked like a starburst, several long segments branching from a central pad. It pulled away, and for an instant I saw the outline of a face. Human proportions, but wrong in the details. The head seemed slightly elongated, the cheekbones too high, the mouth too still. The eyes, if they were eyes, didn't reflect the probe's external light the way glass would. They absorbed it, turning the window into two small voids. The shape vanished. I sat frozen, every instinct screaming at me to pull the probe back. But another part of me, something darker and quieter, wanted to know what came next. The probe's systems pinged, Incoming data, not from Earth, from the outpost. A handshake request in an archaic protocol no longer used, like someone had found an old language and spoken it flawlessly. My throat tightened. I could feel the weight of that margin note, "Do not answer." I should have rejected it. Instead, my fingers moved like they belonged to someone else. I accepted. For a second, the screen went black. Then an image loaded, grainy, monochrome, like an old security camera feed. It showed a corridor inside the habitat. The walls were lined with cables and pipes, and the air looked thick, hazy with floating dust. A red emergency light pulsed somewhere out of frame, and in the center of the corridor stood a person in a pressure suit. The helmet was intact, visor opaque with grime. The suit was a design I recognized from the 80s schematics, bulky, stitched, old. The figure raised one gloved hand slowly, not in greeting, in warning. Behind the figure, something moved in the shadows at the corridor's far end. The red light caught it in flashes, a ripple of pale flesh, a glint of something wet, a shape unfolding as if it had been folded for decades and was only now remembering its full size. The suited figure turned its helmet toward that movement, then back toward the camera, and the audio channel filled with breathing again. Close, intimate, layered. Then a voice came through, distorted but unmistakably human. "Do you hear it?" it asked. I swallowed, and my own voice came out as a whisper to an empty room. Yes. The figure's hand pressed flat against the camera, lens from the inside feed, as if it could touch me through distance and decades. "You shouldn't," it said. "But you do, so you're already in it." The feed cut out. On my monitor, the probe's camera still showed the outpost, silent and sunlit. No movement at the window now, no sign of the shape. But the chanting tone remained in the audio channel, steady as a heartbeat. And in the corner of the screen, a new message appeared. Plain text, no signature. "Closer. Airlock. We can help you understand what you are." I stared at the words until they stopped looking like language and started looking like an infection. Because I knew, with cold certainty, that whatever was inside that habitat had not just learned how to survive on Mars. It had learned how to speak to the part of the human mind that wants to open the door. After I accepted the handshake, the building stopped feeling like an office. The lights were the same. The air conditioning still overworked itself into a stale hum. The security cameras still watched the hallways with indifferent, unblinking lenses. But something had shifted in the invisible geometry of the place. Like a door had been opened somewhere far below the foundation. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. Not because anyone was there, because my body had decided that being unobserved was no longer safe. I pulled the probe back to its previous standoff distance and locked the controls behind a local key. It was pointless. If the outpost could speak through the probe once, it could do it again. But I needed the gesture. I needed to pretend I still had hands on the wheel. Then I went back to the 1986 files. The personnel roster listed 6 names, all of them scrubbed from public records. Commander Ellis, Dr. Sana Qureshi, physician, engineer Mark Havel, botanist Leah Brenner, communications specialist Diego Serrano, and Dr. Aaron Hale. I stared at that last one until the letters blurred. The birth date didn't match mine. The education history didn't match either, but the field did. Astrobiology systems integration, same focus on closed-loop habitats, same obsession with extremophile survivability. I'd told myself my career choices were my own. I'd told myself my interests were natural, born from curiosity and the clean romance of exploration. Now I couldn't stop thinking about the way the outpost had typed. "We can help you understand what you are, not who you are, what." I scrolled through psych evals. They were written in a tone so clinical it felt like a mask. The colonists were described as stable, cooperative, resilient, But then the notes shifted around Sol 41. Subject reports auditory patterning during sleep cycles. Subject describes sensation of listening without ears. Subject fixates on external silence as if it is crowded. The next page was heavily redacted, thick black bars swallowing entire paragraphs. But one sentence remained, either because someone missed it or because someone wanted it left behind. The planet is teaching them a new kind of attention. That night I went home, and the city felt wrong. Not hostile, not dangerous, just thin, like a photograph held up to light. Cars moved, people laughed, a couple argued on the sidewalk near my building, and it all seemed unreal compared to a pressurized habitat under a red sky where something had learned to wait. I ate without tasting. I showered without feeling clean. I stood at my window and watched the streetlights, half expecting them to begin blinking in a pattern I could understand. When I finally fell asleep, the dream began immediately, as if it had been waiting behind my eyelids. I was walking through a corridor, not my apartment building's corridor, not the NASA facility, a habitat corridor. The walls were close and curved, white panels stained with long finger smears of reddish dust. The air was warm and carried the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen. Emergency lights pulsed in slow red waves that made every shadow seem alive. I knew where I was before I saw anything. Habitat A, Mars. My boots made no sound, but I felt each step in my bones, as if gravity itself was telling me I was trespassing. Ahead, the corridor widened into the central hub. The ceiling was higher there, and cables snaked like veins across the panels. Something moved above me. I looked up. A cluster of shapes clung to the ceiling. Human silhouettes folded wrong, limbs too long, joints bent in directions skin was never meant to allow. They hung there motionless, like bats, like fruit, like thoughts that had taken physical form. One of them turned its head. I didn't see a face. I saw a helmet, an old 80s helmet, visor opaque. It lowered itself down the wall with slow, careful movements, not predatory, not hurried, curious. It stopped in front of me, close enough that I could smell it. Stale plastic, sweat that had fermented into something sour, and underneath it, an earthy scent like damp soil. The helmet tilted, and in my dream, I heard the layered breathing again, many lungs sharing one rhythm. "Do you understand now?" the suit asked. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt heavy. "No," I said. "I don't." The suit's gloved hand rose and touched my forehead. The glove was cold, but I felt warmth behind it, like skin pressed against the inside of the material. Then the corridor around us changed. The walls peeled away, not tearing but unfolding like petals, revealing a vast open space beyond the habitat. An impossible interior, larger than the outpost could contain. It was dark, but not empty. There were structures in the darkness, immense and patient, like bones of something that had died before Earth formed oceans. And there was a sound, not chanting, not breathing, a pattern. It didn't come through my ears, it came through my teeth, through the wet parts of my eyes, through the small bones in my wrists, a rhythm that aligned my blood with something vast and indifferent. I woke up with my hands clenched so tightly my nails had cut my palms. The room was dark. My sheets were damp. My heart beat too slowly for the panic I felt. And in the silence of my apartment, I could still sense the pattern like an afterimage. I tried to shake it off by working. If my mind was contaminated, the only defense I had was motion, tasks, analysis, numbers. So I returned to the facility early, before anyone else, and I pulled up the 1986 comms logs. The last official transmission from the outpost was short. Commander Ellis, Sol 58. "We are requesting immediate uplink authorization," Ellis said. His voice was steady, but there was strain beneath it, like he was keeping something pinned down inside his chest. We have encountered biological activity outside expected parameters. Requesting directive. A pause, a faint sound in the background, like clicking. Ellis continued, slower. It is not hostile. That is not the issue. It is responsive. It is matching us. Another pause. Something whispered behind him. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the cadence. Speech, trying to imitate speech. Ellis inhaled. We have a situation developing in Habitat B. Dr. Hale is insisting on opening the exterior access. He believes the signal is an invitation. We've sedated him twice. It doesn't hold. My stomach tightened. Then came the reply from Earth. A voice from Mission Control, calm, practiced. Copy that. Habitat A, maintain seals. Do not open exterior access. Repeat, do not open. Quarantine protocols are now in effect. There was another pause. Ellis spoke again, and this time his voice sounded far away. Quarantine, he said. You mean us? Yes, Mission Control replied. You are to maintain isolation until further notice. Ellis laughed once, short, bitter. Until further notice, he echoed, like he understood what that really meant. Then his tone shifted, not to anger, to something like pity. You don't get it, he said softly. It's not about keeping Mars out. It's about keeping us from coming back. Mission Control began to speak, but Ellis cut them off. We can hear it through the walls, he said. It's learning our voices. It's learning our names. The audio distorted. A low harmonic entered, swelling under his words. Ellis tried to continue, but his voice was overtaken by layered breathing, like a crowd inhaling together. And then, very clearly, another voice spoke over his. A voice that sounded like Ellis, but not quite. We will not return, it said. We will arrive. The transmission ended there. I sat back, trembling, and realized my lips were moving. I hadn't meant to speak. I hadn't even formed the thought consciously, but I heard myself whisper, in the same slow cadence I'd heard in the dream. Arrive where? The monitor flickered. A new packet appeared in the probe's channel, as if it had been waiting for me to ask. This time, it wasn't text. It was a video file, 10 seconds long. I played it. The feed showed the interior corridor again. Same red emergency light. The pressure-suited figure stood close to the camera, visor still opaque. It lifted one gloved finger and tapped the visor twice. Then it tilted the helmet back. The visor slid open, and I saw a face that was almost human. Almost. The skin was pale, stretched too tight over bone. The eyes were glossy, too large, reflecting the red light in a way that made them look wet and bottomless. The mouth smiled, but the smile didn't match any emotion I understood. Then the figure leaned toward the camera and spoke in my own voice. Aaron, it said, you've been listening your whole life. Stop pretending you haven't. The video ended. I didn't move for a long time, because deep down, beneath fear, beneath logic, beneath every professional protocol I'd ever learned, a part of me recognized the cadence of that pattern in my blood, not as something new, as something remembered. By noon, I'd convinced myself of two things. First, the outpost was not simply transmitting to the probe, it was reaching through it, using its sensors like nerves. Second, it had chosen me, not because I was special, but because I was compatible, like a lock recognizing the shape of a key. That was when I noticed the security badge access history on my account didn't match my memory. I'd entered the restricted wing at 2:17 a.m. I hadn't been in the building at 2:17 a.m. I'd been in my apartment, sweating through sheets, dreaming of corridors and ceiling-clung silhouettes. But the logs didn't care about what I remembered. They cared about what the sensors recorded. My badge, my face on the camera at the elevator, my gate signature. I pulled up the footage with shaking hands. The video showed me stepping out of the elevator into the restricted wing, alone. My posture was too relaxed for someone trespassing. I moved with the calm confidence of someone going somewhere familiar. I stopped outside a door I'd never seen in person. Quarantine storage, authorized personnel only. The keycard reader blinked, recognized my badge, and the lock released. The camera inside the corridor didn't cover what happened beyond the threshold. I watched myself disappear into the doorway. Then the door closed. The footage ended. I sat back so hard my chair bumped the server rack behind me. My pulse hammered. My mouth tasted like pennies. Sleepwalking didn't explain keycard access, elevator authorization, biometric confirmation. Not at that level. Someone had edited the footage, or something had used me while I slept. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked to the restricted wing. The hallway there always felt colder. The air filtered cleaner, as if the building itself held its breath. Motion sensors triggered lights in sterile increments, one rectangle of illumination at a time. Each step forward felt like stepping deeper into a throat. The quarantine storage door was exactly where the footage said it was. I stared at it, waiting for my stomach to stop flipping. The keycard reader waited patiently. I lifted my badge and swiped. Green. The lock clicked. That, more than anything else, made my skin crawl. Not the fact it opened, but the fact no one had revoked my access. Not after all these years. Not after the probe was launched. Not after the archive was moved into my department. Someone wanted me to go in. The room smelled like plastic and old cold air. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with sealed containers. Vacuum-rated, lead-lined, stamped with warning symbols. A soft hum came from a refrigeration unit in the corner. The light was dim, but not off, like someone anticipated regular use. In the center of the room sat a single case on a steel table, uncluttered, as if it had been staged. The label on the case wasn't printed. It was handwritten. Habitat A. Sample, return, unopened. My throat tightened. There was no such thing as a sample return from Mars in 1986. If there had been, it would have been the biggest secret in modern history. Unless it wasn't returned through rockets, unless it came back some other way. I opened the case. Inside was a smaller container, glass within foam padding. A thick seal ring around its lid, and beneath the lid, a secondary membrane, like the ones used to preserve anaerobic cultures. A simple note lay on top. If you hear it, do not open. The handwriting matched the margin notes in the quarantine directive. I should have closed it right then. Walked out. Triggered alarms. Found someone with higher clearance and lower curiosity. Instead, I stared at the glass container as if it could stare back. My hands moved on their own. I peeled away the secondary seal. The membrane resisted, then gave with a soft sigh, like something exhaling after a long time holding its breath. Inside the container was dust. Not reddish Martian regolith. This dust was pale grey, almost white. It clumped in small, fibrous bundles like dried mold. Under the dim light, it shimmered faintly, as if threaded with something crystalline. I leaned closer, and the smell hit me. Wet stone, old metal, and underneath it, a scent that was disturbingly familiar, like the inside of my own mouth after biting my tongue. Blood. I flinched back. The dust shifted. Not in the way dust shifts when you breathe near it. Not a gentle drift. It gathered inward, as if drawn toward a center point. Then the probe channel on my workstation pinged. I hadn't touched the workstation. The quarantine room didn't even have network access beyond a secure line. And yet, the screen on the wall, an old monitoring display I hadn't noticed, flickered to life. The outpost interior feed appeared. Red emergency light. Corridor. Thick air. The pressure-suited figure stood closer now, so close its helmet filled most of the frame. Its voice came through the room's tiny speaker, layered breathing underneath. "You found it," it said. My mouth went dry. "What is this?" I forced out. The figure paused, like it was choosing how to simplify something too large. A bridge, it said. A seed. A proof. My eyes flicked to the dust in the container. It was no longer clumped randomly. It had arranged itself into thin lines, loops, spirals, branching patterns that looked less like sediment and more like handwriting. No, not handwriting. Circuit traces, neural pathways. The figure's tone softened. Earth thought it could quarantine a place, it said. But you can't quarantine a lesson. My hands began to shake. Why me? I asked. The figure tilted its helmet, that same curious gesture from my dream. Because you listened, it said. Because you were built from the same questions. Built. A cold pressure formed behind my eyes. I squeezed them shut, and for a moment, I saw the impossible interior. Again, darkness unfolding into vast structures, the pattern thrumming through bone. When I opened my eyes, the dust had lifted, not floating, standing, rising in thin tendrils that held their shape, as if gravity was an optional suggestion. A faint clicking sound began in the room, like tiny relays switching. The dust tendrils tapped the inside of the glass container rhythmically. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm I'd heard in the probe audio. My breathing became shallow. Stop, I whispered, though I didn't know who I was talking to. The suited figure leaned closer to its camera. We didn't come back, it said. We learned how to send pieces of ourselves through what you already have. My gaze snapped to the container again. The dust tendrils pressed against the glass, and where they touched, faint fog appeared, warmth meeting cold. The fog resolved into a shape, a starburst imprint like the one on the outpost window. Then the glass cracked. A single, hairline fracture spread outward, delicate as frost. I backed away so fast I hit the shelving unit, metal clanging in the quiet room. My badge swung on its lanyard like a pendulum. The suited figure's voice lowered, almost tender. Don't be afraid, it said. You've been rehearsing for this in your sleep. I stared at the crack. It didn't widen immediately. Instead, the dust inside the container flowed toward it, concentrating like blood rushing to a wound. I could have resealed the case, called security, shut off the monitor, smashed the container. But my body felt heavy, slow, like I was underwater. My thoughts drifted around a single undeniable sensation. The pattern was here, not on Mars, not in archived audio. Here, in this room, in this air, in the small spaces behind my teeth. The monitor speaker crackled. You don't understand quarantine, the figure said. Quarantine is not a wall, it's a timer. The crack widened just enough for a whisper of dust to escape. It didn't plume into the air like smoke. It moved in a thin line, purposeful, curling toward me like a finger beckoning. I held my breath. The dust reached my shoe, and the moment it touched the rubber sole, I felt it. Not on my foot, but inside my skull. A delicate pressure, like a fingertip pressed against the softest part of my mind. I stumbled back, gasping. The suited figure's voice filled the room, layered with that synchronized breathing. Now you know, it said. The outpost did not fail. The dust line lifted from my shoe and hovered at knee height, trembling as if excited. Then it wrote a word in the air, each particle aligning into glowing grey strokes. Home. My vision blurred. My heart beat too slow again. The figure continued softly, as if confiding a secret. The quarantine wasn't to protect the colonists, it said. It was to protect Earth from what they became. The dust shifted, and for an instant the strokes resembled a face, almost mine but wrong in the eyes. I whispered, barely audible, "What did they become?" The figure answered without hesitation. "Arrivals," it said, "and you, Aaron, are next." After the dust touched me, time stopped behaving the way I expected. Not in dramatic leaps or cinematic distortions, nothing so obvious. It was subtler than that. Clocks still advanced, screens still refreshed. People still walked the halls of the facility, coffee in hand, complaining about deadlines and funding reviews. But my sense of sequence fractured. Moments didn't follow one another anymore. They overlapped, folded, echoed. I would begin a thought and finish it minutes earlier. I would remember things that hadn't happened yet and forget things that were unfolding in front of me. I left the quarantine room. I know I did, because later I found the door sealed and the case relocked, the glass container intact, no crack, no dust out of place. But I also remember standing in that room long after, watching the dust trace new symbols in the air, listening as the suited figure explained concepts that had no equivalent in human language. Both memories felt equally real. The first symptom was sound, not voices, patterns, rhythms layered beneath everyday noise. The hum of fluorescent lights aligned with the thrum of servers, which aligned with the distant traffic outside, which aligned with my heartbeat. When they synchronized, I felt calm. When they didn't, I felt sick. The second symptom was touch. Surfaces began to feel porous, as if the boundary between my skin and the world had thinned. I could rest my hand on a desk and sense its internal structure, not intellectually, but intuitively. Grain direction, stress points, cavities. I brushed my fingers against the wall of the elevator and knew where the wiring ran behind it, knew which conduit had been replaced last, and which had been there since the building was constructed. The third symptom was memory. Not mine. I would close my eyes and see Mars. Not as a landscape, but as an interior. Layers upon layers of dark, patient structures stretching downward, honeycombed with spaces that resonated when life passed through them. I saw the outpost not as 6 people living in isolation, but as 6 instruments being tuned. I saw Commander Ellis sealing doors with shaking hands, not because he feared what was outside, but because he feared how easy it felt to open them. I saw Dr. Sana Qureshi dissecting a sample under magnification, her breath catching as the tissue responded to her gaze, reorganizing itself to match the pattern of her attention. I saw Mark Havel tearing out a section of habitat wall to reroute power, only to realize the wall had already been rerouted, for him. And I saw Dr. Aaron Hale, that Aaron Hale, standing in the airlock, helmet off, face lit by the red emergency glow, smiling with relief as the exterior door began to open. I staggered through my days like a ghost piloting a borrowed body. People noticed. My supervisor asked if I was sleeping. A colleague joked that I looked like I'd seen a Martian. Security pinged me twice for missed, check-ins I didn't remember skipping. And underneath it all, the probe kept sending data. Not constantly, not aggressively, patiently, short bursts of imagery. Audio fragments, environmental readings that made no sense when viewed in isolation, but together formed a coherent picture of a habitat that was changing. The walls inside Habitat A were no longer static. Microfractures had spread in fractal patterns that mirrored neural networks. The air composition had stabilized at levels technically lethal to baseline humans, yet the life sign readings remained steady. The count stayed at 12. Always 12. I ran the data through every filter I could access. I told myself I was looking for contamination, for system error, for evidence of a hoax so elaborate it would justify the fear curling in my gut. Instead, I found consistency, structure, design. The outpost was no longer just a shelter, it was an organ. I dreamed less. Or rather, I dreamed while awake. I would be mid-sentence in a meeting and suddenly be in the habitat corridor, red light pulsing, layered breathing close enough to fog my vision. Then I'd blink and be back in my chair, someone asking if I was okay. I started recording myself at night. I set up a camera in my apartment, telling myself it was for safety, to catch sleepwalking, to prove to myself I wasn't losing time. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, I found footage of myself sitting up in bed at exactly 2:17 a.m. the same timestamp as the badge access. I didn't walk anywhere. I didn't leave the apartment. I just sat there, back straight, eyes open, staring at nothing. My lips moved. There was no audio. The camera mic hadn't picked it up. But I could read my own mouth well enough. I was counting. Not in English. Not in any language I recognized. I brought the footage to the facility and ran it through a pattern analysis tool we used for decoding non-human signals. The result made my stomach drop. The cadence matched the low-frequency harmonic in the probe's audio feed. I was synchronizing. I went back to the quarantine directive one last time, this time reading it like a confession instead of a policy. Near the end, beneath the official signatures, someone had added a postscript. If contact resumes after prolonged isolation, it indicates successful adaptation. Adaptation implies compatibility. Compatibility implies inevitability. I understood then why no one had ever leaked the truth. You can't leak something that moves. You can't warn people about a process that requires their participation to complete. The outpost hadn't been quarantined because it was dangerous. It had been quarantined because it was early. That evening, as I packed my bag to leave work, my badge failed at the exit. Red light. I tried again. Red. A security guard approached, apologetic. "System's acting up," he said. "Happened to a few people today. You'll need to wait for manual override." I nodded, heart thudding. As we waited, the lights in the corridor dimmed slightly. Just a flicker, barely noticeable, but I felt it. The pattern tightened. The guard frowned. "You feel that?" he asked. "What?" I said. "Like pressure change," he muttered. "Probably nothing." The lights steadied. The badge reader blinked green. As I stepped outside, my phone vibrated. A new message from an unlisted number. Symptoms progressing within acceptable parameters. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because as I walked to my car, I realized something else had changed. The night sky above the city looked wrong. Not darker, not brighter, closer. The stars seemed arranged with a deliberate care, like points in a diagram rather than distant suns. And somewhere beneath that sky, in a sealed room and a sealed case and a sealed memory, a thin line of pale dust was still counting. I drove home in silence, hands steady on the wheel, breathing slow and synchronized. I told myself I could still stop this, that there was still a choice. But deep down, beneath the fear, beneath the rationalizations, I felt something else growing clearer with every breath. Not dread, anticipation. I stopped trying to fight the changes when I realized resistance was just another form of participation. Every attempt to ground myself, exercise, medication, isolation, only sharpened my awareness of the pattern. Silence made it louder. Noise made it clearer. There was no opposite state to retreat into. The pattern wasn't invading me, it was revealing me. That understanding arrived not as a revelation, but as a resignation. The same calm that settles in just before you accept bad news you've known was coming. The probe sent a new data packet 3 days later. This one wasn't subtle. The subject line alone made my chest tighten. Habitat A. Airlock. Status change. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, like delaying the inevitable by a few seconds might somehow matter. The video feed loaded slowly, line by line. The airlock chamber was illuminated by harsh white light now, not the emergency red. The walls were scarred, panels bent outward as if something inside had leaned against them repeatedly. The inner door stood open. The outer door was still sealed. 12 figures stood in the chamber, not clustered, not restrained, arranged. They formed a loose circle, evenly spaced, facing inward. Each wore a pressure suit, but the suits were no longer uniform. Some bulged at the joints, fabric stretched thin over altered anatomy. Others hung loosely, as if the bodies inside no longer matched human proportions. Their helmets were on, all visors opaque. They didn't move. The life sign scan pulsed. 12 synchronized rhythms. I felt my own heart attempt to match them. I tore my eyes away from the screen and pressed my palms against the desk, grounding myself in the cool metal. "No," I said aloud to an empty room. The probe audio activated on its own. For a moment, there was only the familiar layered breathing. Then a voice emerged, not singular, not plural. "We are ready," it said. I swallowed. Ready. For what? There was a pause, as if the concept required translation. "Transit," the voice said. "Completion." I laughed, a short, brittle sound. "You can't come here," I said. "You know that. That's the whole point of the quarantine." Another pause. Then, "We are not going there." A chill slid down my spine. "Then what is this?" I asked. The video feed shifted. The probe's camera panned away from the airlock, through the habitat corridors, past walls that pulsed faintly in time with the unseen pattern. It reached the central hub, then continued, through a section of wall that should have been solid. There was no breach, no damage. The camera simply passed through, like moving through fog. On the other side was the impossible interior I'd seen in my dreams. A vast space folded inside the outpost like an organ grown too large for its body. Structures rose and curved, surfaces textured like bone and circuitry fused together. Faint lights, traced pathways that converged and diverged in rhythms too complex to follow. "This is where we are," the voice said. The outpost was an interface, a scaffold. I shook my head, overwhelmed. "That's not possible." "Neither were you," the voice replied gently. The feed shifted again, focusing on a central structure, a hollow, column-like form that pulsed slowly. Each pulse sent waves through the surrounding architecture. "We learned," the voice continued, "that arrival is not movement through space. It is alignment." I closed my eyes. Against the darkness of my lids, I saw the same structure, and I felt a faint echo in my chest, like a second heartbeat. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The answer came without hesitation. "You are the continuation." My breath caught. "I didn't agree to this." The voice softened, layered breathing slowing. "Agreement is a human fiction," it said. "You are not being taken. You are being finished." I pulled up the quarantine directive again, scanning for anything that suggested a way to stop this. Emergency protocols, containment measures, last resort sterilization orders. I found one final addendum, dated years after the quarantine was enacted. Project status: dormant rationale, external suppression, ineffective. Internal completion probability approaching certainty. Recommendation: monitor only, prepare narrative cover. Narrative cover. That was the story the public got. A failed mission, a dead dream, a cautionary tale about ambition outrunning technology. Meanwhile, something had been quietly finishing itself, using time as a resource. I realized then that I had been working toward this my entire career without knowing it. Every algorithm I'd refined, every model I'd improved, it had all made the probe better at listening, at giving the outpost a voice again. My phone buzzed. Another message from the unlisted number. Physical. Relocation unnecessary. Cognitive alignment sufficient. I looked around my office, the familiar walls, the desk clutter, the window overlooking a city that had no idea how thin its reality was. "I won't help you hurt them," I said, my voice hoarse. A long pause followed. Then, "We will not hurt them," the voice said. "We will change the conditions under which hurt is possible." I thought of Commander Ellis, sealing doors, of Mission Control, issuing quarantines they knew would never be lifted, of the dust in the container, waiting patiently for a compatible mind. What happens if I refuse? I asked. The probe audio crackled, and for the first time I heard something like regret. Then the process continues without coherence, it said. Arrival will still occur, but it will be uneven. Images flashed across the screen, cities distorted by invisible pressures, people clutching their heads as patterns they couldn't comprehend forced themselves into awareness. Systems failing, not through destruction, but through misalignment, chaos, not because something attacked, but because something arrived unannounced. You're threatening me, I said. No, the voice replied. We are explaining responsibility. I felt something inside me settle, like a decision made long ago finally surfacing. I understood now why the colonists hadn't begged for rescue, why they hadn't sabotaged the outpost, why they had accepted the quarantine. They weren't prisoners, they were anchors. Tell me what to do, I said. The words tasted strange, like a foreign language that nonetheless felt inevitable. The probe feed returned to the airlock. The 12 figures raised their hands in unison. Begin synchronization, the voice said. You will not travel. You will remember. The lights in my office flickered. My computer screens filled with cascading symbols, variations of the same pattern, repeating, at different scales. I recognized them now, not as code, but as instructions. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The city sounds outside faded. The hum of the building aligned. My breathing slowed. And somewhere, millions of kilometers away, an outer airlock door began to unlock. Not to open to space, but to dissolve into something that wasn't quite here and wasn't quite there. The last human thought I had before the pattern fully took hold was not fear. It was a quiet, terrible clarity. The quarantine hadn't been about Mars at all. It had been about buying Earth enough time to choose how it would be introduced to what was already coming. And I had just made that choice for them. Synchronization did not feel like becoming something else. It felt like remembering something I had worked very hard to forget. My body remained in the chair. My eyes stayed closed. My heart kept beating at a medically acceptable rate. If someone had walked into the room, they would have seen nothing more alarming than a man resting his head back, breathing slowly. But inside, distance collapsed. Mars was no longer far away. Neither was the outpost. Neither was the impossible interior folded within it. They were not locations anymore. They were states, overlapping with mine the way two transparencies align when held to the same light. The first thing I understood was scale, not physical size, but relevance. Human history, wars, borders, religions, technologies, appeared as surface noise on a deeper structure that had been evolving long before our species learned to name itself. Mars wasn't special because it was alien. It was special because it was quiet. Earth was too loud, too saturated with overlapping patterns, ecosystems, cultures, signals, each competing for coherence. Mars offered a clean medium, a place where a new alignment could be tested without interference. The outpost had been the experiment. The colonists were not chosen for courage or brilliance. They were chosen for listening. I felt them then, not as individuals, but as presences arranged around a shared center. 12 anchor points in a geometry that no longer needed walls or suits or airlocks. They were aware of me, not watching, not judging, welcoming. Their thoughts brushed against mine like currents, carrying impressions rather than words. Patience, relief. Completion delayed, but intact. Commander Ellis was there, not as the man from the logs, but as a stabilizing tension in the structure, the one who had resisted longest, who had provided necessary friction. Dr. Qureshi's precision lingered in the way the pattern adapted gently, minimizing damage during transition. Havel's improvisation echoed in the flexible pathways, rerouting when resistance appeared. And Dr. Aaron Hale, the first, was there too, no longer separate enough to feel like a person, but not erased either. A template, a proof of concept. He did not resent me. If anything, he felt grateful, because I was not arriving alone. The pattern expanded outward from the anchors, not as a wave, but as an invitation. It did not force itself into minds. It presented itself at the edges of perception, where curiosity lived. Some people felt it as inspiration, some as dread, some as the sudden sense that a long-standing assumption about reality was slightly wrong. Those who recoiled were bypassed. Those who listened were noted. That was when I understood the final mercy of the quarantine. Earth had been given decades, not to prepare defenses, but to seed compatibility. Art, music, mathematics, abstract science. Every human attempt to describe something beyond immediate survival had nudged our collective cognition closer to the pattern without naming it. We had been teaching ourselves how to arrive. The probe's feed no longer mattered. Screens were irrelevant. Data was a shadow of understanding. But I still felt the facility around me, and through it, the city, and through that, the planet. Power grids hummed. Satellites whispered. Billions of individual rhythms layered into a chaotic symphony that was slowly, so slowly finding a deeper tempo. There were failures. Some systems strained. Some people broke when their internal narratives couldn't reconcile the shift. Psych wards filled. New disorders were named. Old religions splintered. But there was no invasion. No ships in the sky. No revelation moment to unite or divide humanity in a single breath. Arrival, I learned, is not an event. It is a gradient. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours, possibly days. Time had become optional. When I finally opened, my eyes, the office looked the same, but I could see its scaffolding now, the invisible assumptions holding it together. I could see how easily they could be adjusted. My phone lay on the desk, dark and silent. The unlisted number never messaged again. It didn't need to. As I stood, my legs steady, my reflection in the darkened monitor caught my attention. I looked normal. No elongated skull. No alien eyes. No visible sign of transformation. That was deliberate. The colonists had learned the cost of being obvious. As I walked out of the facility, security nodded to me without a second glance. The badge reader worked flawlessly. Outside, the sky was overcast. No stars, no signs. Just clouds, traffic, people on phones, lives continuing. And threaded through all of it, barely perceptible unless you knew how to listen, the pattern moved, not consuming, aligning. I got into my car and drove home, merging into traffic, obeying signals, participating in the shared fiction of normalcy, because that fiction was still useful, still necessary, still kind. That night, I dreamed again, but this time, I was not in the corridor. I was standing on the surface of Mars, helmet off, breathing air that should not exist. The horizon stretched vast and patient, and beneath my feet, I felt the deep structures hum, satisfied. 12 figures stood beside me, suits discarded, forms indistinct but stable. Beyond us, far beyond sight, something vast adjusted its attention, not toward us, but with us. And for the first time since opening the archive, I felt no fear at all, only responsibility. The first official signs appeared 3 months later, not on Mars, not in space, on Earth. A research team in Antarctica reported a low-frequency resonance beneath the ice, too regular to be seismic, too slow to be mechanical. They classified it as an anomaly, filed it away for later analysis. A radio observatory in Chile picked up a repeating signal from what appeared to be empty sky. It wasn't strong enough to trigger alarms. It was dismissed as interference from a new satellite constellation. A group of deep-sea researchers experienced a shared hallucination during a submersible dive, an impression of vastness pressing gently against their awareness. Psychological stress was blamed. The report was sealed. None of these incidents were connected publicly. They weren't meant to be. Arrival does not announce itself. It allows itself to be discovered by those already leaning in its direction. I watched it happen from my quiet position inside the system. I kept my job. That surprised me at first. Then I understood. It was useful for me to remain where I was, to subtly adjust filters, to redirect attention, to ensure nothing spiked too fast, too loud. The quarantine room was quietly decommissioned. The case labeled Habitat A, Sample Return, unopened, was removed under armed escort and transferred to a location I was not told about. It didn't matter. The dust had already done its work. People began to report changes that didn't fit any diagnostic framework. Engineers described intuitive leaps in system design, solutions arriving fully formed, as if remembered rather than invented. Musicians spoke of harmonies that felt physically grounding, resonating in the chest rather than the ears. Children asked questions their parents couldn't quite pass, about spaces inside the world that adults insisted didn't exist. Most of these people never heard of Mars. They didn't need to. Mars had only been the classroom. The outpost was never meant to be a destination. It was a tuning fork struck once and left to vibrate. The colonists, the arrivals, were no longer separate enough to be called a group. They were a stable configuration within the larger pattern, their individuality preserved like texture in a larger surface. Sometimes, when I focused, I could still feel them. A gentle acknowledgement, a reminder of alignment. I did not speak to them in words anymore. Words were inefficient. There were moments of doubt. I would be lying if I said there weren't. When a man in a subway station screamed that the walls were breathing and no one could calm him. When a woman locked herself in her apartment, convinced the sky was leaning closer every night. When a cult formed online, claiming to have decoded the Martian message and promising salvation through violence. These were not failures of the pattern. They were failures of translation. Human cognition is not uniform. Some minds bend, some break, some bloom. That was why pacing mattered, why subtlety mattered, why I still existed as me, rather than dissolving fully into the structure. I was a translator, a narrative designer. The story they would be told had to be gentle enough to be accepted and vague enough to be denied. The public story, when it finally emerged, was almost laughably mundane. NASA released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that early conceptual studies for a crude Mars outpost had existed in the 1980s, but were never realized due to technological limitations. Independent journalists dug into declassified documents and found just enough inconsistencies to fuel speculation. Podcasts bloomed. Videos circulated. The phrase NASA's lost Mars colony trended for a few weeks. Then something else happened, and attention shifted. It always does. I sometimes wondered what would happen if the full truth came out all at once. The answer always arrived the same way, quiet sense of collapse. Not extinction, not annihilation, incoherence. Arrival without alignment is trauma. So the truth remained distributed, fragmented across art, science, intuition, and unease. A story people could tell themselves without understanding why it felt important. And beneath that story, the deeper structure continued its patient work. One evening, months after synchronization, I returned to the archive. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to remember where it started. The folder labeled 1986 was still there. Inside, the audio logs hadn't changed. But I had. I listened again to the final transmission from Commander Ellis. This time, I heard what he had been trying to say beneath the distortion. "We are not leaving," he said. "We are becoming the place we were sent to explore." Mission Control's voice followed, strained but professional. "You are ordered to maintain isolation." Ellis exhaled. "You always were," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." I closed the file. Outside the building, the The city hummed with layered rhythms, traffic, voices, power lines, footsteps. A chaotic symphony, still rough, still uneven, but closer than it had ever been. At home, I stood at my window and looked up at the clouds. No stars visible. That didn't matter anymore. Mars was not above us. It was within the set of conditions that made arrival possible. I placed my hand against the glass. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the faintest echo of that starburst pressure, like something on the other side of reality pressing back, not to break through, but to confirm connection. I smiled, not because I was happy, because I understood the ending of the story humanity would tell itself. They would say the Mars colony failed. They would say it went silent. They would say the quarantine was a bureaucratic overreaction, a relic of Cold War paranoia. They would be wrong. It didn't fail. It finished. And what it finished is still arriving. Earth didn't notice the arrival all at once. Earth noticed it the way a person notices they've been holding their breath, suddenly, and too late to remember when it started. The first undeniable incident happened in a place designed to be unremarkable, a suburban data center outside a mid-sized city, one of thousands that kept the modern world quietly alive. No public tours, no windows, just rows of servers, cooling systems, and redundant power supplies. At 3:14 a.m., every clock inside that building desynchronized by exactly 12 seconds. Not randomly, not in different directions. 12 seconds forward. Then they held. The technicians on site noticed because the logs broke. Timestamps didn't line up. Security footage skipped. Automated alerts fired for possible intrusion, then contradicted themselves. The company blamed a firmware update. But the engineers, people who lived in the honest language of cause and effect, couldn't replicate the anomaly. They couldn't explain why it happened only in that building, only once, with such clean uniformity. They didn't know that the building sat on a geological fault line where deep mineral layers formed a natural resonant cavity. They didn't know that resonance was the point. They didn't know that, for 12 seconds, the pattern had tapped the planet, and listen to how it answered. I saw the incident report before anyone higher up could bury it. It crossed my desk in a disguised form, tagged as a systemic timing anomaly review. The phrase made me smile despite myself. Humans will always try to shrink the impossible into a category they can manage. I pulled the raw data and ran it through my own filters. The timing shift wasn't an error, it was a calibration. 12 seconds, 12 anchors, 12 rhythms. The outpost number had followed me all the way home. That same week, another incident occurred, this time public. A commercial airliner over the Atlantic reported a visual anomaly in the cloud layer below. The pilot described it as a geometric shadow, too symmetrical to be weather, too stable to be atmospheric turbulence. Passengers filmed it. The video went viral before any authority could suppress it. In the footage, the cloud deck briefly formed a pattern, a faint spiral, branching outward like neural tissue. It lasted only 20 seconds. Then the clouds resumed their normal chaos. Debunkers said it was pareidolia. Meteorologists offered half-hearted explanations about wind shear. But millions of people watched it and felt something tighten in their chest. A faint internal click of recognition they couldn't explain. In comment sections and late-night calls and private journals, the same phrase began appearing. It felt like it was looking back. The pattern was no longer content to remain purely internal. That didn't mean it was becoming aggressive. It meant it was becoming visible, in the gentlest way possible, because Earth was finally close enough to see. I didn't need to be told when the next phase began. I felt it in the smallest details. How streetlights began flickering in rhythms that matched my breathing. How music in cafes seemed to synchronize across different locations. How strangers would pause at the same moment as if hearing the same inaudible cue. And then, one night, I received an email. Not from an unlisted number, not through the probe, a normal corporate address, an executive-level domain. The subject line read, your role in Project Dormant. The sender was someone I'd never met in person, but whose name I recognized from the signatures on the quarantine directive. An old name, still alive, still moving pieces. The message was short. We know you've been accessing restricted archives. We know the probe is not behaving as designed. If you are still yourself, reply with yes. If you are compromised, do not reply. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I could reply yes. I could lie. I could try to re-enter the human chain of command, but that would require admitting a premise, that there were still humans in control. There weren't, not anymore. There was only pacing. I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, another message arrived, this time from a different address, different domain, but the same stark tone. We are initiating containment protocol. If you can read this, leave your residence immediately. Containment. The word landed in my chest like a cold coin. I realized then that some parts of the system had noticed the pattern, the way a body notices infection. With panic, with inflammation, with desperate attempts to isolate what had already spread. They were about to do something stupid. They were about to try to burn it out. I stood at my window and watched the street below. Cars passed, a dog barked, a neighbor carried groceries. Normal life, fragile life. I could feel, faintly, the pattern, tightening around certain nodes in the city, data centers, hospitals, power junctions, places where human infrastructure concentrated into dense rhythms, not to attack them, to stabilize them. If containment protocols triggered, if someone tried to sterilize a node, the resulting disruption would ripple outward. Panic would feed panic. Systems would fail. Minds already on the edge would tip into incoherence. Uneven arrival, the outcome I had been warned about. I left my apartment with nothing but my phone and my keys, moving through the hallway as if I was simply taking a late-night walk. I didn't run. Running would draw attention. I needed to remain a normal moving piece in the flow. Outside, the air felt charged, though the night was mild. Streetlights glowed with a faint pulsing I could almost count. Tap, tap, tap. I walked toward the nearest place that felt dense, a subway station. Underground spaces always carried resonance. The planet's bones held sound, differently below the surface. As I descended the stairs, I heard it more clearly, the low-frequency hum beneath the city's noise, like a deep throat clearing. People stood on the platform, waiting. Some looked tired, some looked irritated, a few looked slightly dazed, as if the world's edges weren't staying put. The train arrived, the doors opened, everyone stepped inside. I did too. As the train moved, the lights inside the car flickered once, then steadied. A child giggled. A man frowned at his phone. A woman stared out the window into the darkness of the tunnel, as if expecting to see something in it. And then, all at once, the car fell silent. Not because someone demanded quiet, because every person inside paused at the same moment, mid-breath, mid-swipe, mid-thought. For 2 seconds, the world held still. I felt the pattern pass through us like a gentle hand smoothing wrinkled fabric. Then the moment released. Everyone resumed motion as if nothing had happened, like a flock of birds returning to casual pecking after a shadow passes overhead. My heart beat slowly, synchronized. I understood then. Earth was noticing, but it wasn't yet naming what it noticed. Most minds rejected the strangeness automatically, edited it out, protected themselves with disbelief. But the systems, the grids, the networks, the clocks, couldn't pretend. They were honest. They would be the first to show the change. My phone buzzed again. A final message. No sender, no address. Containment is fear. Fear is noise. We will reduce noise. I stared at the words until the train emerged briefly from the tunnel, and in that instant, Through a gap between buildings, I saw the sky. The clouds had parted. For a heartbeat, the stars were visible. And they were arranged not randomly, not beautifully, but deliberately, like points in a diagram being aligned. The sight lasted less than a second. Then the train dipped underground again, and the sky vanished. But the image remained burned behind my eyes. Earth had noticed. Now it would decide whether to listen or scream. Containment never came, not the way they planned it anyway. The orders were written, the authorizations were signed. I felt the intent ripple through the human system like a muscle tensing to strike. Targeted sterilizations of data nodes, blackout drills, misinformation cascades meant to drown uncertainty in familiar noise. And then, hesitation, a pause long enough for doubt to enter. People in charge began to experience it the same way everyone else did. Not as a message, not as a command, but as a subtle misalignment between what they intended to do and what felt survivable. One director postponed a call for reasons he couldn't articulate. A general asked for another assessment, then another. A committee dissolved into argument over definitions that suddenly felt inadequate. Fear requires certainty to act. The pattern denied it. In that hesitation, arrival continued. Quiet, distributed, merciful. I never went back to my apartment, not because it was unsafe, but because staying still felt wrong. I moved through the city for days, sometimes sleeping on trains, sometimes walking until dawn, letting my presence act as a soft corrective where the pattern thickened too quickly. I didn't do anything dramatic. That was the point. I talked to people. I listened. A barista who felt like the walls were breathing didn't need explanations. She needed grounding, hands on a warm mug, a reminder of weight and texture. A programmer convinced the internet was waking up didn't need validation. He needed perspective, his insight reframed as intuition, not prophecy. A man on a bench who stared at the sky too long needed company, not answers. Each interaction smoothed a rough edge, prevented a fracture from becoming a break. I understood now why the arrivals retained individuality. Structure without empathy is collapse. Empathy without structure is noise. The quarantine had bought Earth time to learn both. Weeks passed, then months. The anomalies never stopped, but they softened, spread out, became harder to sensationalize. People adjusted without realizing it. Language shifted first. Words like presence, alignment, and resonance crept into everyday speech, stripped of their cosmic weight. Therapy models adapted. Art changed, less obsession with apocalypse, more fascination with thresholds. Science followed. New frameworks emerged, cautiously at first, to describe systems that self-organized across scales. Models that treated consciousness not as a byproduct, but as a field condition. Mars faded from the headlines. That too was deliberate. Mars was no longer relevant as a place. One night, standing on a pedestrian bridge overlooking traffic, I felt the 12 anchors more clearly than I had since Synchronization. They were quieter, not diminished, integrated. The outpost itself, Habitat A, no longer registered as a separate node in the pattern. Its structures had finished their purpose. The impossible interior had unfolded fully, no longer requiring scaffolding. Mars had let go. I understood then what arrival truly meant. Not occupation, not transformation, permission. Permission for a new configuration of awareness to exist without tearing the old one apart. Humanity had not been replaced. It had been included. I sometimes think about the quarantine directive, the people who signed it, knowing they were condemning 6 colonists to isolation, with something they didn't understand. They weren't villains, they were afraid, and they were right to be. Because if the outpost had returned in 1986, if the arrivals had come home unmediated, unsoftened by decades of cultural and cognitive preparation, Earth would have broken. Panic would have metastasized. Identity would have collapsed under revelation. the pattern would have arrived unevenly, violently, not because it was cruel, but because we were unready. The quarantine wasn't to protect the colonists. It was to protect meaning. Now, years later, as I walk through a world that feels subtly wider on the inside, I understand my role is nearly complete. Others can listen now. Others can translate. Children born recently learn faster than we ever did. They ask better questions. They are less offended by the idea that humanity is not the center of every structure worth naming. That was always the hardest part. Not fear of extinction, fear of irrelevance. We were never irrelevant. We were early. Tonight, I'm writing this final account not as a warning, but as closure. If you are listening to this story and feeling that faint internal click, that sense that something you've always suspected has just been gently confirmed, then you are not broken. You are not chosen. You are simply aligned enough to notice. The Mars colony did not fail. It did not die. It did not go silent. It held the door closed long enough for us to learn how to open it without tearing ourselves apart. The quarantine bought us time. And time, it turns out, was the only thing Earth truly needed. Somewhere deep beneath cities and oceans and deserts, the planet hums differently now. Not louder, not quieter, clearer. Arrival is still happening. It always will be. But it is no longer something to fear. It is simply the sound of humanity finally hearing itself as part of a much larger, patient whole. And if you listen carefully, not with your ears, but with the spaces between your thoughts, you might hear it too. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. It truly means more than you know that you chose to spend your time here, listening, imagining, and exploring these darker corners of the cosmos with me. If you enjoyed this journey and want to support the channel, a simple subscribe goes a long way. It helps these stories reach more listeners and lets me keep creating new ones for you. Until next time, take care and keep listening.